Is that better? Can you hear me? Excellent. Hi, everybody. My name is Kim. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I really have to apologize right at the gate. I'm a little bit sick today, so please forgive me. I have a throat lozenge, and I'm hoping that I will not cough into the microphone, but if I do, please forgive me. But indeed, today I am here to talk to you about global-scale climate action research, and in particular giving you some insights from a recently conducted large-scale experiment where we collected data internationally, and it's called the International Climate Psychology Collaboration, or the ICPC. So before I get started, I really want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. It's really given me a unique insight into what goes on inside of libraries. I don't know if it's evident or not, but I'm not a librarian. I'm a researcher. My background is actually in climate change psychology in particular, also neuroscience. So really being involved in the panel discussion just now, I got to sneak into some symposiums this morning. It's a really interesting, unique conference that has been organized here today, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. All right, so today we're going to be talking a little bit about the what and why of global research. Why I think it's important, and what I hope to convey to you is that it is something that we need to be doing more often. As well, we're going to be talking about the ICPC, the design, the results, the interpretations. This is going to be a little bit more on the science side of things, but then we're going to switch over and talk a lot about the challenges. And trust me, there were a lot of challenges with this project. And then this in particular is where I think research libraries and librarians can really come in and help out with a lot of this global scale research. And then I'm actually going to end with some questions that I have for you about how you think that you would be able to better contribute to my line of research and what I can do to better help and contribute to research libraries overall. So my research, like I said, I am a cognitive neuroscientist by training, converted into environmental psychology a little bit later on. But a lot of what my research tends to look at is the reciprocal relationships between humans and their environments. And in particular, environments that are changing due to the climate crisis. So for example, exposure to extreme heat, which is something that we are all dealing with right now. I hope I don't need to talk a lot about why I think that this is something that we should be looking at and why we need to motivate more research in this area, because I think it's becoming incredibly evident every single day. So there's kind of two main pathways with which my research investigates these reciprocal relationships. The first one relates from how humans interact with the environment, or how they impact the environment. And here I try to better understand how and why do people engage in different types of environmental behaviors, or climate change behaviors, or pro-climate behaviors, or pro-environmental behaviors, or whatever you want to call them. And this is where this ICPC project comes in. And just in case if you're interested, well, there are at the moment, I think, maybe 11 publications that have now resulted based on this one project alone. The two main ones are the one that was published in Science Advances last year, where we talk about the main overarching results. And the other one, which I think is probably part of the reason why I was invited here today, is actually the data paper. So in my research, I really prioritize open access and open transparent science. And I really tried to make all of my data as openly and easily accessible as possible. And that's what we tried to do with this data paper. But please keep in mind, again, I'm a psychologist, I'm not a data scientist, and so we made a lot of mistakes. Trust me, we're going to talk about them later on. Okay, coming back to my little model here, my research also tries to understand how climate change is impacting us. Excuse me. And this relates to our new project called the HeatCog project, or the Heat and Cognition, where we're developing this project right now. And indeed, at the end of this talk, I'm going to ask if anybody would be interested in collaborating on this, because indeed, I think having the support from research libraries more involved in this project as it develops would be a really, really useful and really awesome thing to have, indeed. All right, so why global scale research matters, or why I think that it matters. Indeed, what is global scale research? Basically, this is research that is conducted across multiple countries, cultures, and contexts. In the ICPC, for example, we collected data from 63 countries across the planet. So like this, I think it is really important to be able to understand all of the different psychological phenomena and beyond in the context of climate change, not just coming from a small select few countries, but actually global. And this is because I'm a big proponent of the idea that global problems require global data and global solutions. So in order to get the global solutions, we need to have the global data, because we need to have an understanding of what's going on, not only in our home countries, but how this is affecting everybody everywhere. So it is a kind of research that is highly collaborative, and I mean highly collaborative. It requires coordination across diverse, multilingual, interdisciplinary teams. So we had 258 co-authors involved in the first project. We now have over 632 co-authors involved in the second project. These are people that are coming not only from psychology, but from climate science, from data science, from policymaking, and everything in between. It allows us to actually pool together expertise from our different collaborators. And indeed, on neither project that I know of so far, do we have any representation from the librarians. So if anybody's interested, please reach out. This kind of research is also inclusive. It moves beyond what we call weird samples. So in psychology, we call them weird samples. This stands for westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies, like, for example, the United States. A lot of research in psychology is based on mainly students in psychology from the United States, and this doesn't really generalize well to the rest of the world. So this type of global scale research really tries to go beyond this problem and be more inclusive, and includes samples that go and allow us to be able to produce more representative insights. It's also comparative. In the first study that we'll talk about, the ICPC, we were actually able to test whether findings are globally consistent or context dependent, right? When we're talking about psychology and talking about different types of interventions, if I use one intervention on myself, maybe that's going to be a lot more effective than if I use that same intervention on you. I am a Canadian who lives in Germany, you probably are not, and therefore there are a lot of different things and a lot of different factors relating to why an intervention or a nudge might work on me but not on another person. Oh, excuse me. It's also transparent-ish and standardized-ish, which we'll talk about again towards the end. But basically, we use a lot of open science practices in order to create what I like to call public goods. And that is that dataset paper that I was talking about before. Inside of that data, there is a plethora of information that has not even begun to be explored yet. And basically, when we were creating this project, we create these projects in a way that we try to use them to ask and answer as many interesting research questions as we can. And like this, then when we publish the data openly, it allows researchers from all walks of life to be able to freely and openly access that data and use it at their own will. So, but the reason why I say it is transparent-ish and standardized-ish is because this protocol is relatively new. There's not a lot of people that actually use this kind of big global international collaborative data, probably because it's really, really hard to do. So like this, I say transparent-ish and standardized-ish because we're still working on the protocols and still trying to better understand how we can refine and better improve these techniques in order to make them at least a little bit easier. All right, so ideally, at least in my mind, I'm a big proponent that almost all science, especially these big global collaborations, should also be policy relevant, or at least be able to have some sort of impact in the real world. So a lot of my research and a lot of the other research in this area tends to support evidence, or produce actually evidence, that can actually inform global decisions. Not all of it, but indeed, I think that if we are going and putting together the effort and doing all these things and investing all the resources and the time and the man hours and so forth to actually conduct these large-scale international projects, that they should have a real-world impact. And as well, they're also logistically complex, but in my mind, I think I'm hoping that I have convinced you that indeed they are also necessary. They're essential for addressing global crises like climate change, which is my kind of field of research, but also all of the other environmental crises, the crisis of misinformation, public health, the spread of COVID, so forth and so on. And I think here, global scale research can really make a huge impact in trying to understand and move and poke and prod people into doing things in a better way and ensuring a more inhabitable and better future for us all. All right, so the ICPC, the case study. What exactly was it? I've tried to tease it a little bit, but please note, indeed, we have all of the little pre-registered stickers up there. It was open science. So in this project, what we did is we crowdsourced the development and then tested 11 psychological interventions in order to increase or encourage climate change mitigation behaviors. We managed to, thanks to our collaborators, we managed to actually acquire data from nearly 60,000 participants from across 63 countries. So it is a huge data set. I mean, huge for me as a psychologist, so I think the resulting data set was less than 1 gigabyte, but still, for us, that is big. But it's a really rich data source where, like I said before, we can use this to ask and answer a lot of really interesting research questions. And this was thanks to the 258 collaborators that were involved in this project. Now, if you have ever written a paper that includes 3, 4, 12, 15 collaborators, and you realize that indeed there is this problem that I like to call too many chefs in the kitchen, imagine having 258 collaborators, right? This was the list that was published. It is huge. So indeed, when I say that running this type of science is not easy, I mean it is not easy. Imagine having all of those people have access to your paper, which obviously they should if their name is going on it, and being able to go through it and be like, no, I don't agree with this, no, I don't agree with this, yes, I do agree with this, no, I don't agree with this. It took us months just to go through iteration 1 of having all of our collaborator comments. So it was a fun project. All right. So the question that is actually at the heart of this project, which we really wanted to understand, and is also at the heart of a lot of my research, is trying to understand how do we promote climate change mitigation. And when I say before things like psychological interventions, I mean small interventions, nudges, prods, behavioral levers, whatever you want to call them. We know from everyday life that these are things that are used very often, right? One example is social norms. I think that this is one of the most ubiquitous, one of the most well-used or well-understood types of interventions that are out there. Saying things like 2/3 of Americans think that the government should do more on climate change. We also have things like talking about the scientific consensus. NASA, for some reason, is a big fan of this one, talking about how 97, 99, 99.9% of all climate experts agree that climate change is caused by humans and that we should probably do something about it. We also have things like emotions, and in particular, negative emotions. So journalists, I think in particular, love to talk about this kind of thing, right? It is absolutely time to panic about climate change. We're all gonna die. Doom and gloom, negative emotions, fear, 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 right? And if we actually look inside of the literature, we can see that more or less every single day, another paper is coming out where they test 1, maybe 2 interventions in a very specific sample of participants at a very specific time point. But what all of this research cannot actually tell us is which intervention reigns supreme. Which intervention is going to be most effective on a global scale? Who are these interventions going to be most effective on? Canadian versus a Swiss versus a Dutch, et cetera, et cetera. And where or in what context do these interventions work particularly well? These are the very small, very easy research questions that we decided to layer inside of this big behemoth project. So I mentioned before that we were crowdsourcing the development of the interventions that we used in our project. What exactly does that mean? Well, basically, we sent out a social media campaign, got all of our collaborators involved in this. Then we went and we were like, wow, we have over 200 collaborators involved. That's insane. Why don't we try to leverage their expertise a little bit? So we sent them a survey, and we actually asked, what intervention would you like to see tested in this context? You were the experts about behavior change, about psychology, about this, that, and whatever. What do you think would be something important to test on a global scale? After that, we had about 36 interventions that were submitted. My co-author, Madalena, and I, we sat down, we blinded everything, we went through, and we kind of removed all of the ones that were not really eligible to use on an international scale. So for example, videos with commentary. Somebody proposed using David Attenborough videos, which would have been amazing, but translating them across all of the different contexts would have been too much of a nightmare, so forth and so on. And we ended up with 11 interventions in the end. We then sent them back to our collaborators and said, these are the 11 interventions we're planning on testing. How do you think that they're going to work? Which one do you think is going to reign supreme in this international context? And which one do you think is not going to work, is going to backfire, so forth and so on? And this is what we see here. Now, these are the 11 interventions. I'm going to present a couple of them to you in the coming slides. I think it's just too much information if I give you all 11 rapid fire. So if you have any questions about any of them in particular, please let me know. I have a lot of backup slides. But basically, okay, we see things like different types of social norms up here. We see over here, we have this negative emotion one. We also have the scientific consensus. So this is the one from NASA. And these are rank ordered in terms of support by 188 of our collaborators. So basically, we can see that our collaborators, who to be fair, were mostly social psychologists, said that things like different types of social norms are going to work the best, right? And by the way, I also asked ChatGPT, and this was way back when it was like the first ChatGPT that was publicly available. Also confirmed with our collaborators that indeed social norms are probably going to be the ones that work the best. All right, so let's take a look at some of the interventions. First, let's talk about the norms. So a dynamic social norm. In order for me to explain a dynamic social norm, I first need to explain a static one. So a static social norm is something like what I presented before. 2/3 of Americans are doing something, right? It generally includes a majority of participants and explains what they are doing. A dynamic norm is a little bit different. Here it is more momentum. There's some more momentum. So basically it says a large portion of your people like you are starting to do something. And this is something that we try to reinforce inside of this intervention. So participants were presented with on different slides, different information, something like this. Since 2013, concerns about climate change have started to rise in most of the countries that we have surveyed. So participants were actually exposed to different snippets of information like this, trying to activate this dynamic social norm, saying that people are becoming activated and this is something that they are starting to do. Then we have the work together norm. And I really want you to pay attention to this work together norm because it's going to come up again and again throughout my talk here. It's also called the identity norm a little bit later on in my presentation. And this was the second most highly rated by all of our collaborators. Participants were presented with this flyer. Do it together, we need to reduce our carbon footprint, so forth and so on. A majority of people are doing it, et cetera, et cetera. Then they were presented with several screens where it was asking participants, if you saw this flyer in your neighborhood, how likely would you be to work with your fellow Americans or your fellow Swiss or whatever in order to fight climate change, in order to do this, this, and whatever. So like this, it was supposed to harness not only a social norm, but this idea and mentality that we need to work together and in order to be effective, in order to help combat climate change. Next, we're going to jump down to psychological distance. Excuse me. So for psychological distance, there is a phenomena inside of environmental psychology that basically says that climate change is a really unique problem for us because we find it to be psychologically distant. This is something that's going to be happening in 50 years to people in a far-off land that are very different from me. When in actuality, we can see that it's not, right? So I think it was like, 38, 39 degrees in northern Germany last week. It was 40 degrees in Seville. These are problems that are impacting us drastically right now. So this intervention tried to really reduce the psychological distance. It said things like, if greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, we'll exceed the 1.5 degree threshold within the next 4 years, which is something that definitely came true because indeed that happened last year. It also tried to reduce the temporal distance. So that was a temporal distance. It's not the far off future, it's now. The social distance, so it's not people in far off lands, it's people like you, and it is going to be impacting you in particular. So across several different pages, participants were presented with different types of information that was meant to reduce this psychological distance. Next, we're going to jump down to the negative emotion induction. Now, this is one that I put together, specifically because I wanted to show that this doom and gloom, fear-style messaging does not work. Keep that in mind for later. But basically, we went and we scraped not all of, but a lot of the media that talks about climate change in this doom and gloom narrative, and we tried to put it together in kind of this big, overarching recipe where we said things like, there is no escape, time is running out, the window to act is closing, so forth and so on. And it was meant to instill participants with a little bit of fear and have this kind of doom and gloom signal. And then finally, we're going to talk about intergenerational framing, or letter to the future. This intervention was one of my favorite, in actuality, not developed by me, by the way. But basically, participants were instructed to think about a child that was socially close to them now. Maybe it could be their child, a friend's child, a niece, a nephew, whatever it is. Now, mentally project them into the year 2050 when they have their own family. Write them a letter that basically describes the efforts you have been taking in order to ensure a more stable planet for this family in 2050 and the legacy that you want to leave to them. So like this, participants have to go and change their thinking a little bit and think about how their actions now are going to be impacting the future generations, excuse me. Okay, so the survey design. Basically, everything was programmed inside of the survey platform called Qualtrics. It looked like this. It was a relatively simple design. Participants signed up. They first saw the informed consent. Then they were given one of the interventions or a no intervention control condition. So if I got one condition, let's say I got negative emotions, he would get psychological distance, so forth and so on. So it's a between subjects design. So participants were only given one intervention. Then they had to rate the dependent variables, which include things like beliefs and behaviors, we'll talk about in the next coming slides. And then we have all of our different demographics and so forth. So things like age, gender, political orientation. All right, so what were our dependent variables? We had 4 of them. 2 that I say were more psychologically leaning, and 2 that are a little bit more behaviorally leaning. The psychological ones include belief in climate change. How much do you believe that climate change is happening and that it's man-made? The next one was policy support. How much do you support endorsing policies that will help us to actually mitigate and reduce the impacts of climate change? The next dependent variable, one of the more behaviorally leaning ones, was something that we call willingness to share information on social media. So participants were presented with this text. Did you know that removing meat and dairy for 2 out of 3 meals a day is a great way to cut your carbon emissions? Hashtag climate change. And we asked participants, would you be willing to share this information on your social media? If yes, please do so now. Go ahead and copy it and actually post it on the internet. And what's really cool about this is that we could actually go, and as our project was being rolled out, we could see people posting on Twitter, back before Twitter became X and blew up or whatever, but we could actually go and we could track participants as they were going and talking about our project, which was actually really, really cool to see, because we could see across all of the different languages and across all of the different countries where participants were actually going and posting this information. All right, the last dependent variable is called the WEPT, or the Work for Environmental Protection Task. So this is a really interesting task, and it's actually part of my favorite part of this entire collaboration. So the WEPT is a multi-trial web-based procedure in which participants can choose to exert voluntary effort screening numerical stimuli in exchange for a donation to a pro-environmental fund. So they thus have the opportunity to produce an actual environmental benefit at an actual behavioral cost. So participants were presented with information like this, and we said, okay, go ahead and find any instance where there's an even first digit and an odd second digit. You have to go and then circle the 21, the 63, 27, so forth and so on. So this was an incredibly cognitively demanding and incredibly boring task. Okay, so basically by the time you were finished going through this, so each page, there were 60 different number combinations where participants had to go and screen, and because I had to pilot this so many times, I felt like my eyes were actually bleeding by the end of it. But they had to go through and click all of these number instances. And we explained to them, in exchange for going and doing this incredibly boring, incredibly tedious thing, we were actually pairing with the Eden Reforestation Project in order to plant a tree. And for every page of this task that you engage in, we will go and plant 1 tree on your behalf, which is actually something that we did. So not only did this project lead to some sort of, at least a little bit of scientific insight, but it was one of the few projects that I've ever done in my career that has had a real world impact, because we actually managed to plant over 300,000 trees, thanks to the efforts of all of our participants. So you might be asking, what is the link between clicking numbers and climate change? This doesn't make a lot of sense, and I would agree with you. But the idea here is that when you have to engage in a pro-environmental behavior, usually it's cognitively demanding and or at least effortful. Let's say that I want to go and recycle this bottle. Do you see anywhere in here that I would be able to do that? Probably not, right? It's usually far easier for me to throw this bottle away rather than going and tracking down a recycling plant or a recycling bin, something like this, right? So like this, it kind of mimics the same thing. Participants have to put in extra effort in order to be able to get the environmental benefit. Okay, so test time. What do you think the average belief in climate change was across the 63 countries that we had tested? If you think it is 66%, go ahead and put up your hand. So what do you think belief in climate change is sitting at internationally? You got 1 or 2 people? What about 76%? Okay, quite a bit more. 86%? Okay, not bad. 96%? Okay, a couple of ambitious people, I like you. So before this project, I would have said definitely 76%, no questions asked. So in actuality, I was wrong. If you said 86%, go ahead and pat yourself on the back, because indeed, that's how high climate change belief is right now. And what's even more exciting about this result is look at the variance. So this gray bar that you see here, this is the between country variance. So the country that is the lowest is Israel, with something like 78, 79%, all the way up to the Philippines, which is basically at 100%. So like this, it means that internationally, there's very little variance between countries, at least the countries that we polled here, in suggesting that indeed, people do actually believe in climate change. What about policy support? I said policy support would be more around the 50s. In actuality, it was 72%. It was huge. And again, this variance is so very, very small between our different countries. But what about the behaviors? Here's where things get a little bit less warm, glowy. So for the sharing behavior, so we actually removed participants who said that they did not use social media. And so these are the only participants that actually use the social media. So we asked them, would you be willing to do this? Yes or no? Please do so now. Did you do it? Yes or no? And that's those results there. And we can see that basically we have the entire spectrum, from Latvia down at like 19%, all the way up to Kenya at like 98%. So like this, when it comes to actual climate action, or an intention-like measure, action-like measure, it seems like there's a lot of variance between our different countries. What about this tree planting behavior? Here we see that indeed, we also span the full spectrum, but at least we are above the average. So this is on an 8-point scale, 5.2 is above the halfway point. Okay, so this means that indeed people are willing to invest some effort. But what's actually really awesome is that 50% of all participants that were included in our task, so 50% of the 60,000 participants that we polled, were willing to do everything that they could. They completed all 8 pages of this cognitively demanding, incredibly boring, incredibly effortful task in order to earn these trees. So to me, this suggests that indeed, people are willing to put in the effort, especially when we tell them where exactly the goalpost is. So far, we can say that the vast majority of participants not only believe in climate change, but are also willing to support policy designed to help mitigate it. And also, a large proportion of people are willing to do everything that they can to help us combat climate change. So what about the interventions? Here's where things get a little bit complicated and a little bit messy, but we will go through it together. So this is belief in climate change here. So you can see on this axis, we have belief in climate change. Here we have each one of our interventions that are rank ordered in terms of efficacy. So at the top here, so this dotted line actually represents the control group. So if any intervention is above this dotted line, that means that they significantly increased participants' belief in climate change. If it's below that line, it means that it backfired. And it would have been better if we had done nothing to those participants at all, rather than giving them that intervention. So here, we can see that reducing psychological distance, this intervention that I talked about in the beginning, was the best one at increasing participants' belief in climate change. But then down here, this identity norm is actually that work together norm that I asked you to think about or to remember from the beginning. This is the one that was rated to be, by our experts, to most likely to be the second most effective intervention. Not only was the worst, but actually reduced participants' belief in climate change. Oops. All right, so now let's look at these results slightly differently. This is a very complicated graph, and I apologize, but we will go through it together. Bam. All right, so here we have belief in climate change. So this is the same graph that we saw before. Here we have support for policy, we have the share behavior, and then we have the environmental action. And like this, we wanted to put it this way because you can actually see, so for example, psychological distance here is the top intervention for belief. It worked for policy, but wasn't necessarily the best intervention for policy. It also worked on the sharing behavior, but then looking at the action, it actually backfired on the action. It reduced participants' likelihood to actually engage in this effortful behavior. And indeed, if you look at the results from this, the vast majority of our interventions reduced participants' willingness to engage in that high-effort pro-environmental behavior. And that's problematic. Let's take another example. Let's talk about negative emotions. So remember, this is the one that I designed because I wanted to show that it doesn't work and that we should stop using it. It didn't really work for belief. It really didn't change the needle at all. For policy support, same thing. It was the best intervention to get people to take to social media, but then was also the worst intervention for this effortful behavioral task. What? Very complicated, right? Imagine us the first time that we were actually looking at these results and trying to make sense of them and being like, what is wrong with people? How is it that you would think that somebody who's willing to post on social media would be the same kind of person that is willing to engage in an effortful task and is the same kind of person that's willing to believe in climate change and support the policies. But what we show here is that this is not necessarily true at all. So it seems to be that there is a lot of difference depending on the outcome you're looking at. Excuse me. So indeed, no single intervention worked well across all outcomes. And I think part of the reason why is because there was so much between country variance. So if an intervention worked well in one country, it backfired in another country, you take the average of the two, it looks like it doesn't work. And additionally, globally, we saw very, very small effect sizes. So if we're looking here at this, the psychological distance increasing belief in climate change, that was only a 2.3% increase. Very, very, very tiny, right? So we only managed to move the needle just a little bit. So these results, whereas the results that I presented on the first slide were a little bit, the previous slide were a little bit more encouraging, these results were a little bit more depressing. But let's dig into them a little bit more. So like I said, I think that probably part of the reason why is that there were differences between countries were quite large. So what we did was we actually put together what we call the Climate Intervention web app. And you can follow the QR code here, and you can actually go and take a look at our data, which we made publicly available, and we attempted to make it user-friendly. It's not, I apologize. But still, we can go through it together. And basically, you can go onto this web app, and you can look at our data, and you can break up participants. So for example, here, we're going to look at Swiss participants, and we're going to look at their belief. And here, basically, these are rank ordered, the interventions, in terms of the best intervention to the least effective intervention. So here we can see that effective collective action, one that I didn't talk about so far, is the best acting intervention. But in actuality, it only increased compared to the control by 4.5%, which again is not huge. I probably would guess that that's not even statistically significant. Here, we're only looking at the difference in the averages, so this is not statistical testing, so please take that into account. But when we compare this to a country like France, which I would argue is relatively a lot closer culturally to Switzerland as compared to a place like Japan or somewhere in Africa, so forth and so on, we can see, at least for belief, there seems to be a relatively similar pattern, right? The best acting intervention on both sides was this effective collective action. Nothing was particularly effective in France as well, so 6%, that might have been borderline significant, but probably not. And we can see that things were backfiring kind of at a similar rate. And indeed, here we see, consistent with the overarching results, that this work together norm was not very effective in either country. Okay, but what if we look at the behavior? Well, this time I'm going to start with France for the effect. Bam. When I pulled this up a few days ago, I was like, wow, I should be presenting this result a lot more. But basically, here we can see that system justification increased participants' willingness to engage in this high-effort behavioral task by 23%. And in actuality, there are 3 or 4 different interventions there that really boosted the French's willingness to engage in this task. These are some of the biggest effect sizes that I've ever seen inside of this task, and I have been playing with this data for years. What if we compare that to Switzerland? We can see that every single intervention backfired, and almost backfired to the same degree as the best acting intervention in France, right? We see that negative emotion induction was the one that backfired by 32%. That is huge. So when we're doing our analysis that I showed you in the previous slides, when you take the average of these two countries, they basically cancel out and make it look like none of the interventions really work. And part of the problem is that indeed these individual level differences, I think, are what's really driving these effects. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. But if we look at system justification here, it increased by 23% in France, backfired by 11% in Switzerland, take the average of them two, and they basically cancel each other out. Okay, so some summary conclusions. First of all, when it comes to encouraging pro-climate behaviors, one size does not fit all. There is no magic bullet that is really going to get us out of this problem, which isn't really that surprising, right? If there had been a magic bullet, we probably would have used it so much by now that it would have been rendered ineffective, or we would have had a lot more progress on combating climate change. Intervention efficacy depends very much on individual level characteristics. This is one thing that I've definitely learned inside of this project. Interventions therefore need to be tailored according to the characteristics of their target audience. Just because it works in France doesn't mean it's going to work in Switzerland. In addition, no single intervention worked across all outcomes. So interventions need to be tailored to the outcome of interest overall, right? Experts were also very much unable to predict these results, which is also problematic, but for an entirely different presentation. But indeed, this underscores the importance of actually testing multiple interventions in tandem, and also for running this big international kind of collaborations, because no expert was able to predict that there would be so much variance between our different countries across our different outcome variables. The vast majority of participants, however, actually believe in climate change and are willing to support policies in order to be able to design to mitigate it, which is something that I think is one of the most important driving features of this experiment. We need to go to our policymakers and be like, look at this, look at this. So what we wrote in the paper is that now is the time for policymakers, governments, and beyond to enact tangible climate change reform. That is something that I did not want to put in the paper. What I wanted to put in the paper was, now is the time for us to demand reform. And then the editors made me remove that. But anyway, I told them specifically, I will present it this way. I think that we need to go and band together as citizens in order to be able to influence policymakers, in order to be able to get them to actually move their butts. All right, so behind the scenes, sorry, I'm running a little bit late, but let's talk about the challenges of global research. Let's zoom back out. So there were a lot. I cannot even convey to you how many challenges there were here. We've banded together with some other people who have run these big international projects, and we have actual support groups for people who are coordinating these now. Anyway, so on the human side of big team science, imagine coordinating across time zones, languages, disciplines, research norms, and institutions. The institutions were actually the biggest problem when it came to actually conducting this experiment. Trying to get one invoice paid by two different institutions, one institution said it wasn't fair, so forth and so on. It was a nightmare. Ensuring methodological and data consistency. This was a huge problem. Basically what we did was we developed the survey design, we gave that design to our collaborators, said go ahead, please translate it and adapt it to your cultural context, and then give us back the data, and we'll pool it all together for analysis. We should not have done that. Basically, our collaborators, they changed the names of the different columns. They changed some of the instructions inside of the things that we were measuring. They went and in Europe, for example, the decimal place is the comma, but in North America, it's the period. So some people gave us CSV files where everything was just a huge mess. It took us months to be able to kind of go together and put all of this into something that was usable so that we could actually have some results. Managing data from so many diverse sources, like I just mentioned, was incredibly problematic. On the logistical side, we did not pre-register our workflow, and I'm really, really sad about that. And we definitely should have, and this is something that we're doing in the next iteration in our next projects. Version control was also a pretty big problem, especially amongst our collaborators. They just went and they were like, oh, I think this is the one that we used. Yeah, maybe, probably. Not everything was fully translated, so forth and so on. It made a lot of problems when we were actually trying to analyze and clean the data because we couldn't really tell exactly where the data had come from. Tracking intervention materials and translations. So at the time where I was running this experiment, I was at NYU. And as is the procedure at NYU, for some unknown reason, as soon as I left and I moved on to the University of Vienna at the time, I lost access to my entire NYU server, which means that everything that I had on that server was deleted. So this means that a lot of the materials that we had when we were actually developing the interventions was just gone, and we will never be able to get it back. Thanks, NYU. Creating and implementing a coherent data management plan. So please don't come for me when I say this, but we didn't even have a data management plan when we ran this study. I know that it is a really big problem, and I apologize. Please don't hate me. But basically, running this type of big international project is really, really difficult. And it had never really been done before. And this was like a real-time figure of me wandering around trying to figure out and do the best that I could with what we had at the time. And now, for the next projects that we're running, I think that we are a lot more well-prepared in how to be able to run them. But at the same time, it was really, really difficult. So looking ahead, making global research work. So this is where, on slide 29, is where I think really I'm going to try to tie in the LIBER conference overall. So in order to support sustainable global research, I think that we need early structured data management planning. I fully agree with that, and I apologize that we didn't have it for the first one. We also need to have support for standardization, reuse, and ethical sharing. This was a really big problem in the first project. All of the data is freely available. It's not necessarily easily available, and those two things are something that are very different, and I think that we need to have a more direct look on. But indeed, in order to be able to ethically share all of our data, this was something that was really complicated in order to organize between our different institutions. And so the panel just before, we were talking about, or they were talking about, a really nice panel by the way, talking about digital formats and changing, and I think that they were talking mostly about research materials, research outputs, but what about even actual research data? This is something that we didn't really know how to do, and again, we were walking around in the dark when we were writing that paper. we need better streamlined, long-term accessible archiving solutions. I think that this has kind of been a bit of a theme of the conference so far, and we need to ensure accessibility and reproducibility over time. But at the same time, I think we also need to consider the carbon cost. I'm sorry to be that person, but in order to sustain all of these servers, in order to sustain and keep this data for a long time, this results in a lot of carbon emissions, right? OSF, the Open Science Framework, which is the one that most psychologists use to store their data, in order to go and put your data there, it's freely available, it's really easy to do, it's no big problem. But at the same time, if we have multiple duplicates or if we store things that we don't necessarily need there, then we're basically just contributing to the problem overall. And that is a big shame and I think something that deserves a lot more attention and a lot more discussion. We also need high quality metadata and discoverability tools. This makes research more findable and meaningful across disciplines. So basically, like our Shiny app, but better. That app was actually programmed by a really brilliant master's student, but at the end of the day, I can use it because I have intricate knowledge of the app itself, of the data, of what we were doing, but I'm not necessarily sure how easy it is for other stakeholders to actually go and be able to use that data. So I'd really love if anybody has any ideas on how to actually make this something more usable and more accessible, that would be great. Infrastructure for interdisciplinary international collaboration. Again, I cannot stress to you how difficult it was to collaborate across all of these different research institutions. It seems like it was made to be intentionally difficult to do, which is such a shame. And I think that if we had a better infrastructure in this way, then it would be able to ensure sharing across institutions, language, and platforms a lot more easily. We also need better integration across different open science knowledge systems. So imagine if you were a policymaker or you were a think tank, governmental think tank or whatever, and you want to explore the impact of heat waves on human well-being. Then you shouldn't need to go to one open source data set in order to look at weather data, and then another one in order to look at hospitalizations, and another one to be able to look at behavioral outcomes, so forth and so on. Ideally, they should all be in a centralized data source. So here, I think behavioral science, on our side, should connect more with these different kind of research infrastructures in order to better link and better coordinate between these different data sources. And I think that these are all areas where research librarians and research libraries, in particular, are already kind of leaders, or can at least be key partners. So this is why I am so thankful for the organizers for inviting me here today, because it has really given me a little bit of behind-the-scenes appreciation. And I appreciate all of you, by the way. On behalf of all scientists, we appreciate librarians, but this has given me even more appreciation for what you guys are doing and what you guys have to deal with. So really, really quickly, the Heat and Cognition Project. This is a new project that we are that I'm working on with my group at the Environmental Collective Behavior Group at the University of Constance. Basically, we are going to be looking at how exposure to extreme heat impacts different facets of the human mind. So cognitive performance, social functioning, so forth and so on. And we're also trying to better understand who is most vulnerable and in what context these are really problems. So like this project, I think, is even bigger and even badder than the first one. And it stands to have a huge impact on society. But I think here, research libraries, and I think the University of Constance might also be here, so if you are, please reach out to me, would be able to come in and contribute. And if anybody here is also interested, please reach out to me and reach out to us. And if you have any ideas, please, you are very welcomed. Please join our consortium of over 600 collaborators that we have so far. So really quickly, my questions to you. How can research libraries better support global scale research? You guys are the experts, so I would like to be able to hear from you. What are your pain points when supporting interdisciplinary research that kind of puts together things from many, many, many different fields and many different institutions? And what models or innovations are you seeing that might actually be able to help me carry out my research? So really quickly, some of the links that I've promised. If you want, you can go ahead and scan the QR code on the top, and you can actually see the interventions themselves. Scan the one on the bottom. It's the same one for this Shiny web app. The main papers, if you were interested, are over here. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much, Kim. It's great to hear that you have at the end very well summarized a role for libraries in this research area. I mean, some years ago also, looked into, this was in the context of the Belmont Forum, what are the expectations towards infrastructures and sharing data, what was used at the time. And of course, this is a very, it's a field which is moving, and in Europe we have the European Open Science Cloud, where these infrastructures are supposed to be integrated. So you always have, of course, bits and pieces which are like the Open Science Framework, which are kind of outside of the system, but in your research area, we'll certainly also have used other infrastructures. So is there any question from the audience to Kim?
So thank you so much for presenting on global research. I think libraries have a lot to offer in terms of experience and collaboration. My name is Martha Kirilidou, and some people know me in the library information science field for developing LibQual, and that's a 25-year-old effort that has been collecting data on average about 50,000 cases every year, institutional research on libraries, and measuring library service quality. Probably half of the people in this audience have forgotten that they have done this survey because it has this history, COVID happened. So a lot of the challenges you've offered, I'd love to have a more detailed discussion with you. We are also, after 25 years, I think, undergoing some changes. The home for this effort, the Association of Research Libraries, is shutting down the infrastructure we developed. The current platform was a 2009 effort. It was actually my dissertation at that time. And we're actually facing a transition in terms of governance and how we need to be moving this effort into the future. So yes to global research. I love your challenges, and let's talk more about how we can make progress. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. I would love to have a chat with you after, if you're still around.
Other comments? Yeah, over there. Please bring the microphone.
Hi, Bernhard Schubert from the University of Vienna. I thank you for all the important work that you're doing. I have a probably really ignorant question because it sort of interests me what the reply is. You mentioned that the belief in climate change is actually quite high, quite established. But how do you account for the possibility that the willingness to participate in the research is probably or maybe strongly correlated with the existing belief in climate change?
So you think that maybe our belief in climate change estimates might be a little bit overinflated because people who believe in climate change would be more likely? So that is a great question. And indeed, that is an important question. I didn't talk about it here, but how we actually recruited our participants for the majority of the sample, we asked all of our collaborators when they were collecting the data to use market research companies. So instead of going and just asking people who already believe in climate change, do you believe in climate change? We actually went and had more or less representative samples, at least for age and gender, from over 75% of this sample. So like this, we can say that indeed, we know that this is indeed a problem, and it's probably at least a little bit of a problem inside of our data set, but the majority of the data that we collected was from these representative market research teams. And indeed, what we see is that there's kind of almost a bimodal distribution. The vast majority of people are well on the belief side, and there's kind of a little bit of a bump, let's say, on the climate skeptical side. And those are like really the climate denier type people. So like it is a really steeply right-leaning curve, and this is quite consistent with a lot of other data. So for example, from the World Value Survey, so forth and so on, that we see that indeed climate change, belief in climate change is much higher than what a lot of people would believe. So yeah, two answers. I think that it might be a little bit of a problem, but probably not that bad because of the way that we actually recruited the participants.
Okay, that's very encouraging. So now how do we bridge the gap to getting people to actually do something?
I mean, that is the $1,000 question, right? So, or the $1 million question even. Yeah, I think this is something where a lot of research in my field hasn't dedicated a lot of work. we tend to look mostly at the kind of low-hanging fruit, the easily achievable outcome variables, and that is how much do you intend to do this behavior. And one thing that we know in this field is that intentions do not equal behavior. So unfortunately, actually doing the experimentation that has real behavior in it is really, really challenging to do. It's really complicated and it's very expensive. So like this, it's not always necessarily prioritized in our field, where as an academic, you are encouraged to publish quickly, to publish easily, publish cheaply, so forth and so on. So like this, I would love to be able to answer your question effectively, but unfortunately, we are still working on it now.
Thank you so much.
I also wonder if you have asked them about their roles in society. I mean, you have very much assumed them as citizens in a way, but there might, of course, be some conflict in terms of that they personally believe and would like to act, and then they have, of course, an environment which either enables this behavior or is kind of in the way, or you have some other expectations. You have investigated this a little bit. I mean, their roles.
So your question
and
is
also
about
conflict when it comes to acting. I mean,
yeah, so that is another really great question. Unfortunately, I can't answer, at least on a global scale. There's a lot of really interesting research that is starting to come out now, looking more at how people perceive their role in climate change. And as you might expect, indeed, the average person believes that it's not really me. I'm not the problem. It's the big corporations. I'm not the problem. It's the rich people. I'm not the problem. It's the governments. It's the policymakers. It's this, that, and whatever. Where unfortunately, people don't tend to appreciate the fact that, I mean, who elected the government officials? It's the people. Who gave all of this power to the institutions? It's the people, so forth and so on. So I firmly believe that people underappreciate and undervalue how much power the individual has at actually shaping the system. And indeed, we definitely need a lot more system reformation in this field. But in order to do that, we need to mobilize the individuals in order to be able to do this. So it kind of needs to be a top-down and bottom-up approach at the same time.
so Janice, you also wanted to? Yeah, please.
Hello, thanks for your talk. I had one science question and one maybe library question. For the science one, you said you mentioned that you pooled a bunch of experts and they made predictions about what intervention would be most effective. Did you divide this or look at it by country as well, if they were more accurate per country?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Can I answer that first before you get to the next one? All right, so what I showed here was we asked overarchingly all of our collaborators, which intervention do you think is going to be best internationally? And that's the results that I published here. But we also added on an additional forecasting experiment where we looked only inside of the United States and we asked government officials, academics, general audience, and climate change communicators, so journalists, whether or not they thought these different interventions would be effective at increasing or decreasing belief, support, and the effortful behavior. And basically, people, especially academics, were best for the psychological variables, belief in climate change and support for climate policies. But when it came to the effortful behavior, nobody was really able to anticipate that so many of the interventions would backfire because we had very similar results to the main country or to the international data sets as also in the United States. So like this, we did both. And it seems like indeed experts, yeah, for psychological variables, yes, for the behavioral variables, no.
Okay. And then I guess as you began this project, did you look into collaborations with libraries or?
We did not.
Okay. So
we should have.
Did you look into, are there already infrastructures available to help with international collaborations?
So at the time, like I said, I started this when I was at NYU and then I moved to the University of Vienna and then I moved to the University of Constance. So like this, I was really kind of on this fun academic postdocing pathway that ends up here, there, and everywhere. So unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to look at this. And what we did was relying a lot on our collaborators, asking around for asking for suggestions, so forth and so on. So this is part of the reason why I was excited to also present here today, because now we have this new project where it's even bigger and even badder than the first one. And like this, I think that it would be a great point of collaboration with different research libraries.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, just Thomas.
Okay. My name is Yannis Tsakonas, University of Patras, Greece. Thank you very much for the talk.
I would like to ask one very simple question. I mean, you presented 11 interventions. Okay, how easily reusable they are in order to explore and interpret any kind of threat, because now we are dealing about the threats about the climate change, whether this can be behaviorally explore and interpret any kind of threat. For instance, I think that the previous panel and this panel, somehow through this instrument they are connected, because at some point we presented a couple of threats for libraries and copyright, licensing, anything. And sometimes we believe that, yes, this situation doesn't affect us. This situation doesn't affect our institutions because we are so well-established institutions and we will not be affected. And then all of a sudden it might be me, Caroline, who are quite nervous and, we have the negative dimension in our speech. So how easily it can be, from your with your scientific background as psychologist, behavioral analyst, researcher, it can be used in other settings?
So, that is a great question. There has been a lot of research using a lot of behavioral nudges or these types of interventions across many different contexts, right? Unfortunately, not very many of them have gone on the global scale. So globally, I'm not sure that I could necessarily inform your answer very specifically. I can say that a lot of these interventions, especially things like social norms, tend to work better in countries like the weird countries, right? The Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. So this is also part of the reason, I think, why people tended to vote for those ones. But at the same time, we saw that those didn't actually work very well. So, and on top of that, we can also say that experts are not very good at being able to predict what will and will not work. So I would love to be able to give you an answer, but it would only be my personal opinion, and it might, or probably would be wrong anyway. But if I had to guess, I'm also a social psychologist, so I'd probably say social norms is probably the way to go. But if you're talking about trying to use these interventions in order to mobilize people to combat different types of threats, I think that this is a really important and really critical area where a lot more research needs to be taken. Unfortunately, I cannot give you a solid answer.
So thank you again. So we are now coming to the closing session. So thank you all for your contributions and your wonderful talk.